Hi guys, Mr. Ryan here. We're going to read from chapters 36 to 39, so we'll stop at 40 today. Alright, 36. They put 4 of the unbroken jars in the burlap sack, in case they might be able to use them. Stanley carried the sack, Zero held the shovel. I should warn you, Stanley said. I'm not exactly the luckiest guy in the world. Zero wasn't worried. When you spend your whole life living in a hole, he said, the only way you can go is up. They gave each other the thumbs up sign, then headed out. It was the hottest part of the day. Stanley's empty canteen was still strapped around his neck. He thought back to the water truck, how he wished he had at least stopped and filled his canteen before running off. They hadn't gone very far before Zero had another attack. He clutched his stomach as he let himself fall to the ground. Stanley could only wait for it to pass. The sploosh that had saved Zero's life, but it was now destroying him from the inside. He wondered how long it would be before he, too, felt the effects. He looked at Big Thumb. It didn't seem any closer than when they first started out. Zero took a deep breath and managed to sit up. Can you walk? Stanley asked him. Just give me a second, Zero said. He took another breath, then, using the shovel, pulled himself back to his feet. He gave Stanley a thumbs up sign, and they continued. Sometimes Stanley would try to go for a long while without looking at Big Thumb. He'd make a mental snapshot of how it looked, then waited maybe 10 minutes before looking up at it again to see if it seemed closer. It never did. It was like chasing the moon. And if they ever reached it, he realized, then they'd have to still climb it. I wonder who she was, said Zero. Who? Mary Lou, said Zero. Stanley smiled. I guess she was a real person on a real lake. It's hard to imagine. I bet she was pretty, said Zero. Somebody must have loved her a lot to name a boat after her. Yeah, said Stanley. I bet she looked great in a bathing suit, sitting in the boat while her boyfriend rowed. Zero used the shovel as a third leg. 2 legs weren't enough to keep him up. I gotta stop and rest, he said after a while. Stanley looked up at the Big Thumb. It didn't look any closer. He was afraid if Zero stopped, he might never get started again. We're almost there, he said. He wondered which was closer, Camp Green Lake or Big Thumb. I really have to sit down. Just see if you can go a little. Zero collapsed. The shovel stayed up a fraction of a second longer, perfectly balanced on the tip of its blade, then fell next to him. Zero knelt, bent over with his head on the ground. Stanley could hear a very low moaning sound coming from him. He looked at the shovel and couldn't help but think that he might need to dig a grave, Zero's last hole. And who will dig a grave for me, he thought. But Zero did get up, once again flashing thumbs up. Give me some words, he said weakly. It took Stanley a few seconds to realize what he meant. Then he smiled and said, R-U-N. Zero sounded it out to himself. Run. Run. Good. F-U-N. Fun. The spelling seemed to help Zero. It gave him something to concentrate on besides his pain and weakness. It distracted Stanley as well. The next time he looked up at Big Thumb, it really did seem closer. They quit spelling words when it hurt too much to talk. Stanley's throat was very dry. He was weak and exhausted. Yet, as bad as he felt, he knew Zero felt 10 times worse. As long as Zero could keep going, he could keep going too. It was possible, he hoped, that he didn't have any of the bad bacteria. Zero hadn't been able to unscrew the lid. Maybe the bad germs couldn't get in either. Maybe the bacteria were only in the jars which were open easily, the ones now carrying in his sack. What scared Stanley the most about dying wasn't his actual death. He figured he could handle the pain. It wouldn't be much worse than what he felt now. In fact, maybe at the moment of death he would be too weak to feel pain. Death would be a relief. What worried him most was the thought of his parents not knowing what happened to him, not knowing whether he was dead or alive. He hated to imagine what it would be like for his mother and father, day after day, month after month, not knowing, living on false hope. For him, at least, it would be over. For his parents, the pain would never end. He wondered if the warden would send out a search party to look for him. It didn't seem likely. She didn't send anyone out to look for Zero, but no one cared about Zero. They simply destroyed his files. But Stanley had a family. She couldn't pretend he was never there. He wondered what she would tell them, and when. What do you think's up there? Zero asked. Stanley looked at the top of Big Thumb. Probably an Italian restaurant, he said. Zero managed to laugh. I think I'll get a pepperoni pizza and a large root beer, said Stanley. I want an ice cream sundae, said Zero, with nuts and whipped cream, and bananas and hot fudge. The sun was almost directly in front of them. The thumb pointed up toward it. They came to the end of the lake. Huge white stone cliffs rose up before them. Unlike the eastern shore where Camp Green Lake was situated, the western shore did not slope down gradually. It was as if they had been walking across the flat bottom of a giant frying pan, and now they had to somehow climb out of it. They could no longer see Big Thumb. The cliffs blocked their view. The cliffs also blocked the sun. Zero groaned and clutched his stomach, but he remained standing. I'm all right, he whispered. Stanley saw a rut about a foot wide and 6 inches deep running down the cliff. On either side of the rut were a series of ledges. Let's try there, he said. It looked to be about a 50-foot climb, straight up. Stanley managed to hold the sack of jars in his left hand as he slowly moved up from ledge to ledge, crisscrossing the rut. At times he had to use the side of the rut for support in order to make the next ledge. Zero stayed with him somehow. His frail body trembled terribly as he climbed the stone wall. Some of the ledges were wide enough to sit on. Others stuck out no more than a few inches, just enough for a quick step. Stanley stopped about 2/3 of the way up, on a fairly wide ledge. Zero came up alongside him. You okay, Stanley asked. Zero gave him the thumbs up. Stanley did the same. He looked up above him. He wasn't sure how he'd get to the next ledge. It was 3 or 4 feet above his head. He didn't see any footholds. He was afraid to look down. Give me a boost, said Zero. Then I'll pull you up with a shovel. You won't be able to pull me up, said Stanley. Yes, I will, said Zero. Stanley cupped his hands together and Zero stepped on his interwoven fingers. He was able to lift Zero high enough for him to grab the protruding slab of rock. Stanley continued to help him from below as Zero pulled himself onto the ledge. While Zero was getting himself situated up there, Stanley attached the sack to the shovel by poking a hole through the burlap and he held it up to Zero. Zero first grabbed onto the sack, then to the shovel. He set the shovel so that half the blade was supported by the rock slab. The wooden shaft hung down towards Stanley. Okay. Stanley doubted this would work. It was one thing for him to lift Zero, who was half his weight. It was quite another thing for Zero to try and pull him up. Stanley grabbed hold of the shovel as he climbed up the rock wall, using the sides of the rut to help support him. His hands moved one over the other up the shaft of the shovel. He felt Zero's hands clasp his wrists. He let go of the shaft with one hand and grabbed the top of the ledge. He gathered his strength for a brief second, seeming to defy gravity. He took a quick step up the wall. With Zero's help, pulled himself the rest of the way over the ledge. He caught his breath. There was no way he could have done that a few months ago. He noticed a large spot of blood on his wrist. It took him a moment to realize that it was Zero's blood. Zero had deep gashes in both hands. He held the metal blade of the shovel, keeping it in place as Stanley climbed. Zero brought his hands to his mouth and sucked up his blood. One of the glass jars had broken in the sack. They decided to save the pieces. They might need to make a knife or something. They rested briefly, then continued on up. It was fairly easy to climb the rest of the way. When they reached flat ground, Stanley looked up to see the sun, a fiery ball bouncing on the Big Thumb. God was twirling a basketball. Soon they were walking in a long, thin shadow of the thumb. Chapter 37. We're almost there, said Stanley. He could see the base of the mountain. Now that they really were almost there, it scared him. Big Thumb was his only hope. If there was no water and no refuge, they'd have nothing, not even hope. There was no exact place where the flat land stopped and the mountain began. The ground got steeper and steeper, and then there was no doubt they were heading up the mountain. Stanley could no longer see Big Thumb. The slope of the mountain was in the way. It became too steep to go straight up. Instead, they zigzagged back and forth, increasing their altitude by small increments every time they changed directions. Patches of weed dotted the mountainside. They walked from one patch to another, using the weeds as footholds. As they got higher, the weeds got thicker. Many had thorns, and they had to be careful walking through them. Stanley would have liked to stop and rest, but he was afraid if they'd never get started again. As long as Zero could keep going, he could keep going too. Besides, they didn't have much daylight left. As the sky darkened, the bugs began appearing above the weed patches. A swarm of gnats hovered around them, attracted by their sweat. Neither Stanley nor Zero had the energy to swat at them. "How are you doing?" Stanley asked. Zero pointed thumbs up. Then he said, "If a gnat lands on me, it'll knock me over." Stanley gave him some words. "Bugs," he spelled. Zero concentrated, then said, "Oogs." Stanley laughed. A wide smile spread across Zero's sick and weary face as well. "Bugs," he said. "Good," said Stanley. "Remember, there's a short U if there's no E at the end, okay? Here's a hard one. How about Lunch? Suddenly Zero made a horrible wrenching noise as he doubled over and grabbed his stomach. His frail body shook violently, and he threw up, emptying his stomach of the sploosh. He leaned on his knees and took several deep breaths, then straightened up and continued going. The swarm of gnats stayed behind, preferring the contents of Zero's stomach to the sweat on the boys' faces. Stanley didn't give him any more words, thinking he needed to save his strength. But about 10 or 15 minutes later, Zero said, "Lunch." As they climbed higher, the patches of weeds grew thicker. They had to be careful not to get their feet tangled in the thorny vines. Stanley suddenly realized something. There hadn't been any weeds on the lake. "Weeds and bugs," he said. "There's got to be water around here somewhere. We must be getting closer." A wide, clown-like smile spread across Zero's face. He flashed the thumbs up sign, then fell. He didn't get up. Stanley bent over him. "Come on, Zero," he urged. "We're getting close. Come on, Hector. Weeds and bugs. Weeds and boogs." Stanley shook him. "I've already ordered your hot fudge sundae," he said. "They're making it right now." Zero said nothing. Chapter 38. Stanley took hold of Zero's forearms and pulled him upright. Then he stooped down to let Zero's body fall over his right shoulder. Then he stood up, lifting Zero's worn-out body off the ground. He left the shovel and sack of jars behind as he continued up the mountain. Zero's legs dangled in front of him. Stanley couldn't see his feet, which made it difficult to walk through the tangled patches of weeds and vines. He concentrated at one step at a time, carefully raising and setting down each foot. He thought only about each step and not the impossible task that lay before him. Higher and higher he climbed. His strength came from somewhere deep inside himself, and also it seemed to come from outside as well. After focusing on Big Thumb for so long, it was as if the rock had absorbed his energy and now acted like a kind of giant magnet pulling him toward it. After a while, he became aware of the foul old odor. At first he thought it came from Zero, but it seemed to be in the air, hanging heavy all around him. He noticed the ground wasn't as steep anymore. As the ground flattened, a huge stone precipice rose in front of him, just barely visible in the moonlight. It seemed to grow bigger with each step he took. It no longer resembled a thumb, and he knew he'd never be able to climb it. Around him, the smell became stronger. It was the smell of despair. Even if he could somehow climb Big Thumb, he knew he wouldn't find water. How could there be water at the top of a giant rock? The weeds and bugs only survived by the occasional rainstorm, like the one they had seen from camp. Still, he continued toward it. If nothing else, he wanted to at least reach the thumb. He never made it. His feet slipped out from under him. Zero's head knocked against the back of his shoulder as he fell and tumbled into a small, muddy gully. As he lay face down in the muddy ditch, he didn't know if he'd ever get up again. He didn't know if he'd even try. Had he come all this way to just need water to make mud? He crawled out of the gully, along the gully in the direction that seemed the muddiest. The ground became gloopier. The mud splashed up as he slapped the ground. Using both hands, he dug a hole in the soggy soil. It was too late to see, but he could feel a tiny patch of water at the bottom of his hole. He stuck his head down and licked the dirt. As he dug deeper, and as he did so, more water seemed to fill the hole. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it, first with his fingers, then with his tongue. He dug until a hole that he dug until he had a hole about as deep as his arm was long. There was enough water for him to scoop out with his hands and drop on Zero's face. Zero's eyes remained closed, but his tongue poked out between his lips, searching out the droplets. Stanley dragged Zero closer to the hole. He dug and scooped out more water and let it pour on out of his hands onto Zero's mouth. As he continued to widen his hole, his hand came across something, a smooth and round object. It was too smooth and too round to be a rock. He wiped the dirt off and realized it was an onion. He bit into it without peeling it. The hot, bitter juice burst into his mouth. He could feel it all the way up to his eyes, and when he swallowed, he felt its warmth move down his throat and into his stomach. He only ate half. He gave the other half to Zero. "Here, eat this." "What is it? What is it?" Zero whispered. "A hot fudge sundae." Chapter 39. Stanley awoke in a meadow, looking at the giant rock tower. It was layered and streaked with different shades of red, burnt orange, brown, and tan. It must have been over 100 feet tall. Stanley lay a while, just looking at it. He didn't have enough strength to get up. It felt like the insides of his mouth and throat were coated with sand. And no wonder, when he rolled over and saw the water hole. It was about 2.5 feet deep and over 3 feet wide. At the bottom lay no more than 2 inches of very brown water. See, if he could dig that small of a hole, I could definitely dig the 5 by 5 foot hole. Like, he dug that in like 2 seconds. I can dig the 5. It won't take 6 hours. Anyways. His hands and fingers were sore from digging, especially under his fingernails. He scooped out some dirty water in his mouth, then swished it around, trying to filter it with his teeth. Zero moaned. Stanley started to say something, but no words came out of his mouth. He had tried to say, "How you doing?" It hurt to talk. "Not good," Zero said quietly. With great effort, he rolled over, raised himself to his knees, crawled over to the water hole. He lowered his head into it and lapped up some water. He jerked back, clutched his knees to his chest, and rolled to his side. His body shook violently. Stanley had thought about going down to the mountain to look for the shovel, so he could make the water hole deeper. Maybe that would give them cleaner water. They could use the jars as drinking glasses. But he didn't have the strength to go down, let alone make it back up again. He didn't know where to look. He struggled to his feet. He was in a field of greenish-white flowers that seemed to extend all the way around Big Thumb. He took a deep breath, then walked the last 50 yards to the giant precipice and touched it. Tag. You're it. Then he walked back to Zero in the waterhole. On the way, he picked up one of the flowers. It actually wasn't one big flower he discovered, but instead each flower was really a cluster of tiny flowers that formed a round ball. He brought it to his mouth, but had to spit it out. He could see the part of the trail he had made the night before when he carried Zero up the mountain. If he was going to head back down and look for the shovel, he realized he should do it soon while the trail was fresh. But he didn't want to leave Zero. He was afraid Zero might die while he was gone. Zero was still lying doubled over on his side. "I've got to tell you something," he said. "Don't talk," said Stanley. "Save your strength." "No, listen," Zero insisted, then closed his eyes as his face twisted with pain. "I'm listening," Stanley whispered. "I took your shoes," Zero said. Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. Shoes were on his feet. "That's all right," he said. "Just rest now." "It's all my fault," said Zero. "It's nobody's fault," said Stanley. "I didn't know," Zero said. "That's okay," Stanley said. "Just rest." Zero closed his eyes, but then again he said, "I didn't know about the shoes." "What shoes?" "From the shelter." It took a moment for Stanley to comprehend. "Clyde Livingston's shoes?" "I'm sorry," said Zero. Stanley stared at him. It was impossible. Zero was delirious. Zero's confession seemed to bring him some relief. The muscles in his face relaxed. As he drifted into sleep, Stanley sang softly to the song that had been in his family for generations. If only the woodpecker sighs, the bark on the tree was just a little bit softer, while the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely, He cries to the moon, if only, if only. All right. See you guys tomorrow.